Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, Noam Chomsky has always been a controversial figure, long before the unsettling Epstein era associations that later surfaced, including images of him oddly laughing it up with Steve Bannon, of all people. Chomsky was already provoking outrage across the political spectrum. I can say that I haven't always agreed with him either. Although, of course, there have been some smears against him which have been ridiculous. And, I could get into that, but that'll be for some other episode. But controversy alone isn't a reason to dismiss an argument. And whatever one thinks of Chomsky as a person, some of his most endearing observations about American power were made long before these associations, and they remain deeply unsettling. These observations that he made, perhaps more relevant now than ever, because we have hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, which is 2020, but apparently people are slow to learn from their mistakes, or however you want to look at them. You know, not just mistakes, but egregious crimes. And I'm going to get into that a little bit here. So, one of Chomsky's most chilling insights was this: what terrified him most about American violence wasn't the generals who openly talked about annihilation. It wasn't even men like Curtis LeMay, who cheerfully discussed bombing entire nations back into the Stone Age and once described the bombing of Japan, the nuking of Japan, as something like the biggest firecracker the Japanese would ever see. That's apparently an actual quote. LeMay was frightening, but his brutality was naked. You knew exactly what he stood for. What truly disturbed Chomsky was the more calm type of person who would defend atrocities: the political scientists, the policy experts, the economists, the people in conference rooms speaking in measured tones, discussing mass death as if it were a technical glitch to be optimized. He described the terror of, quote, the detachment and equanimity with which we view and discuss an unbearable tragedy, end quote. The detachment, the ability to speak about human suffering without emotional or moral engagement, is what Chomsky identified as one of the most dangerous features of American exceptionalism. Because once violence is reframed as a technical problem, ethics sort of disappear from the question. Civilian deaths become collateral damage, we've all heard that term. Illegal invasions become strategic interventions. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. That's right, some of you don't remember that term, enhanced interrogation. But during the Trump administration, boy, they sure used that term quite a bit as a defense for torture. And suddenly, with this sort of terminology, the moral weight of killing dissolves into spreadsheets, policy briefs, and abstract models. This isn't accidental, it's institutional, by the way. Think about the Rand Corporation analysts who were calculating optimal bombing patterns in Japan. Think about Ivy League economists quantifying acceptable death tolls in Latin America. Think about modern think tanks modeling nuclear exchange scenarios as detached equations, calmly estimating survivability curves. These people don't see themselves as villains. That's the point that makes them a little bit crazy and more daunting. They're professionals, they're rational, they're rigorous. And that's exactly why Chomsky found them more terrifying than any bombastic military men. At least someone like LeMay acknowledged the nature of his work. The technocrats seem to deny it altogether. This is what Chomsky described as a culture of impunity, a system where American power operates beyond moral judgment or legal consequence. When CIA torture programs are designed with input from psychologists and implemented as if by medical professionals, when drone operators refer to human targets as bug splat, when university researchers develop autonomous weapon systems without ever questioning how or against whom they'll eventually be used. That's when violence reaches its most chilling form. It's not loud, it's not theatrical, it's more banal. And there's a term for that, the banality of evil, which doesn't live in people shouting slogans as much as it lives in reasonable people optimizing the parameters of human suffering. And what makes this system especially dangerous is that it reproduces itself. Each generation of technocrats normalizes levels of violence that would have once been unthinkable. Strategic bombing becomes counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency becomes drone warfare. Drone warfare becomes AI driven targeting. Autonomous weapons become just another research grant. The language changes, the detachment doesn't. Even when disasters are later acknowledged, Vietnam, Iraq, the so called war on terror, they're framed as mistakes. Like if you drop a hot dog on the sidewalk or something. They're not framed as crimes, not moral catastrophes, just unfortunate miscalculations, like, you know, tripping on your own shoelace or something like that. The institution that produced them will remain intact. The experts move on, often, just living normal lives, and their resumes stay polished, and in a lot of cases, people will still respect them. And over time, the public's capacity for outrage seems to erode, at least in many cases. When brutality is hidden beyond uh, sight and behind euphemisms and statistics, moral reflection becomes impossible, or at least close to it. Violence becomes background noise. Even revelations about elite hypocrisy, about who had access to power, protection, and forgiveness, barely register anymore. They're absorbed as just another data point. And you see a similar thing with different phenomena like school shootings, other forms of violence. People become numb to them over time. It's just like a cost of living in the United States. Stephen King once described three types of fear: the gross out, the horror, and potentially the worst one, terror, when everything looks the same, but something is deeply wrong. He described it as like the lights go out and you feel something behind you, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. And correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you would disagree with this, but that's oddly similar to the terror that Chomsky was warning about. Similar to the fear people experience in an authoritarian society in general. It's a lurking presence that you can always feel. Everyday normal life still goes on for most people, but as the empire expands and simultaneously seems to collapse into paranoia, you may still get this sense that something's always off, even if you can't put your finger on it. There's like a lingering presence of some sort of vague terror, even when you don't know where it's coming from. And that is one of the hallmarks of authoritarian societies. And America is, you know, in many ways similar to an authoritarian society, actually. So, you know, the fear, the lingering fear, that's because even if you're normal, like a normal person who's normally apolitical, you're still likely unconsciously aware of violence going on somewhere, even if off in the distance and in the darkness somewhere. The media and politicians might make it seem like it would be ordinary street crime that you have to fear, or some thief in the night, or a serial killer, or something like that, maybe a terrorist. But most of us are at least vaguely, tangentially aware of systemic violence too, especially with things like ICE invading some of our American society or cities and clumsily going about enforcing surveillance to, boost oligarchic and fascistic interests. People are now increasingly afraid of that scenario, and it makes me think of the Stephen King definition of terror, where you're basically trying to lead a normal life, but you're aware that things aren't the same. Like everything feels off. Something's wrong. Like there's nowhere that you can go where you'll feel safe. There's nobody you can trust, that sort of thing. And, it's a generalized underlying fear that dominates our political system increasingly, our society, and to some extent ourselves. It is certainly a large part of what propels this system along too over the years. Just this fear of crime, this rampant paranoia about immigrants and things like that, because the system promotes itself as some sort of general protector, so it needs to create new enemies, either abroad or domestically. And even if you oppose the Trump administration, if you are an average citizen, you will still likely see the solution as coming from the very same system that encouraged this orange menace to ascend to power in the first place. And honestly, that simple concept of the system as protector is really one of the core ways that the system perpetuates itself, really. If it seems like it provides our safety, then how can you conceivably criticize it? Thus, its violence continues largely unabated, based on the defense mechanism that it might sometimes keep people safe. So conformity, even in its most basic sense, is actually partly what allows for systemic violence to keep growing in size and scope. The premise that the system is legitimate and that it does play a protective role and all of that kind of stuff. It ultimately, even if it's well intentioned, feeds into this phenomenon of encroaching on authoritarianism, because we draw our hope from authority. Yet you can't rebel against everything, can you? And so you might feel powerless if you feel at all, and that's sort of how they get you. You might not want to seem like a rebel because, well, in addition to the fact that you'll be possibly targeted in some way if you're a genuine rebel, but you don't want to be mocked, because if you're kind of promoting yourself as a rebel, then people will make fun of you. They'll say that you're trying to appear like a tough guy, or maybe tough gal. Maybe they'll dismiss you as being paranoid, etc., etc. And that's been the case, when it comes to this society all along. If you're if you're a critic, there's going to be people out there who will instantly criticize you. And I guess if there's any good news right now, it's that Trump is probably too sloppy and stupid to keep this system of abuse going totally unabated. Though Trump represents some of the absolute worst aspects of American society, he might still be bad for the system, actually. He is simply too over the top, too stupid, too weird, and too overtly authoritarian or fascistic. His lust for power and violence is too on the nose. So it kind of makes it so that the evil looks less banal and more like something people should perhaps mobilize against. So our authoritarian system actually thrives more when it is a system that looks civilized, sounds reasonable, and uses all the right words. But quietly, methodically, it calculates how much human suffering is acceptable. And going back to Chomsky, he extends this critique even further in recent years to artificial intelligence. AI systems, he has argued, operate on a just following orders logic. They don't understand meaning, they don't comprehend morality, they optimize objectives without ethical awareness. So that's why it's both predictable and shocking that apparently the Elon Musk AI program called Grok, which is just about the dumbest name ever, but Grok is apparently being implemented as the Pentagon's artificial intelligence program. And keep in mind, Elon Musk is somebody who regularly parrots neo Nazi style talking points on Truth Social. And for extra emphasis, he even did a Sieg Heil, obviously, during Trump's inauguration. Well, he did two of them, technically. I guess for extra emphasis on his fascistic leanings. And ironically, you can find an old video that involves Elon Musk warning us about the dangers of AI technology to be used, in a violent manner. You can find an old video about that involves Elon Musk. So that's a little bit of an irony here. So, when it comes to, these AI things, AI doesn't create a new danger, it just mirrors an old one, really. A society that outsources moral responsibility. And that started long ago. And that may be Chomsky's most unsettling legacy, the realization that the greatest threat isn't fanaticism as much as it is professionalism without conscience. Because most people will ultimately recognize fanaticism as some sort of threat. The real danger, I mean, chaos can be dangerous, but the biggest danger is not chaos but order, not rage but calm that is able to commit cruelty. So because the calm voices are still there, they're still calculating, still detached, and still terrifying as they implement a dystopian future. And again, one of the good things right now is that Trump appears to be a lunatic to a lot of people. So that might actually help avert some of the worst directions that we could go in. You know what I mean? The fact that he doesn't look like the calm, collected, and sane person that really propels some of the worst atrocities along. So let's just hope that the people, including myself, I suppose, will be properly understanding the next steps forward. And that includes severe restrictions on presidential power, and of course, to no longer think that the atrocities are just the cost of doing business.